I'll be moderating our discussion for today. The purpose of our Lunch and Learns is to provide 20,000 clinicians and trainees the opportunity to learn and additional information on their advocacy efforts. Our hope is that these sessions will also provide doctors and medical students with an opportunity to connect with others doing health advocacy work of particular interest to them. We do have a few ground rules for our Lunch and Learn sessions, and these are for all of our DFA events. First of all, and as a medical student, there's no such thing as a stupid question. And speaking of questions, we have a question and answer feature at the bottom of the screen, and we really encourage you to use that. And we'll be using those questions in the second half of our session today. Take a look at our chat box as well, because our DFA staff will also be putting some helpful links in there as well. Now, I'm asking you all to be mindful of your questions and comments, because every individual is at a different stage of their education and advocacy journey. This could be a first step for some or a continuing education opportunity for others. And we really welcome each of you as you are from wherever you are in your advocacy journey. And we encourage patience and good intentions from all our participants. And then we'll also be live streaming this on Facebook Live, and the recording and materials will be provided to you after the session. So today we'll be discussing the details of drug pricing policy reform and some common concerns that are raised. For context, Americans pay over 250% more for life-saving prescription drugs than individuals living in 32 other comparable countries globally. Nearly 4 in 10 Americans are forced to ration their medications due to high drug prices. A recent staff report from the House Committee on Oversight and Reform noted that taxpayers could save more than $25 billion with a B on just 7 drugs over a 5-year period if Medicare could directly negotiate drug prices with pharmaceutical companies. H.R. 3, or the Elijah Cummings Lower Drug Costs Now Act, was first introduced and passed by the House of Representatives in December 2019. The bill was reintroduced in the House recently and allows Medicare to negotiate drugs prices for insulin and top 25 selling drugs in 2024, and a minimum of 50 drugs in subsequent years, and establishes an upper payment limit of 120% of the price for 6 comparable international countries. The bill also limits Medicare patients on out-of-pocket costs to $20,000 annually, collects rebates on excessive prices increased above inflation, and cracks down on anti-competitive behaviors. It is currently part of the larger budget reconciliation package being debated now in Congress, and it is estimated to save about $500 billion over 10 years by the Congressional Budget Office. These savings could be planned to increase access to dental, hearing, and vision benefits for Medicare recipients. These days, it's really hard to find trusted sources of information, and it is particularly confusing to comprehend fact from fiction in the age of digital misinformation. To help sort us through these details accurately and to learn more about the latest drug pricing reform efforts, we have 3 terrific trusted health policy experts panelists who have kindly volunteered their time to be with us today. I would like to invite each of them briefly to introduce themselves and highlight why they became passionate about drug policy reform. Let's begin with Ms. Maura Calsyn, followed by Dr. Benjamin Rome, and also Dr. Mariana Socal.
Hi, thank you all for having me today. It's a pleasure to be with you. My name is Maura Calsyn. I'm the Vice President of Health Policy at the Center for American Progress in Washington, D.C. We are a multi-issue think tank. And I would say, looking at drug pricing is a key part of broader healthcare policy. I think, all of us on this call are committed to ensuring eventually, hopefully sooner rather than later, universal coverage that is affordable and accessible for all, and making sure that drug prices, reflect the value of the drugs that are taken and make sure that they are actually affordable for patients is a key part of that entire effort.
Hi, everybody. My name is Ben Rome. I'm an instructor of medicine at Harvard Medical School, and I'm a primary care physician and a health policy researcher at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, Massachusetts. I am part of an interdisciplinary research group called PORTAL, or the Program on Regulation, Therapeutics, and Law. And it's located within the Division of Pharmacoepidemiology and Pharmacoeconomics. My research is focused primarily on the use, regulation, and prices of prescription drugs. And I'm particularly interested in value-based prescription drug pricing and the impact of out-of-pocket costs on patient care. So thank you for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here.
Hi, everybody. I'm Mariana Socal. I'm also a physician. I trained in adult neurology, and I have a PhD in health systems. And I am faculty here and an associate scientist at the Department of Health Policy and Management at Johns Hopkins. Here at Hopkins, I do research on drug affordability and drug pricing. And I also teach classes on pharmaceutical policy in the US. So, today we can, I fully have to agree that there's no such a thing as a stupid question, especially on such a hard and complicated topic. And a large part of what I do is to assist in the policy debates and talk to policymakers, decision makers when needed. And it's very exciting to be able to be here today and also talk with you about this very important moment in our policymaking right now.
Thank you all for introducing yourselves. I would like to begin our conversation by posing 5 key questions. And I'll start sharing each of them one at a time and invite our expert panelists to respond. For our first question, the promise and discovery of novel medications to improve the health of patients, prolong life, and reduce suffering is a key motivator for patients and their physicians. What do we know about prescription drug innovation over the last few decades? Who can we thank for these discoveries, and how might this be affected by allowing Medicare to negotiate drug prices? And if Ms. Calsyn would like to start, that'd be great.
Sure. I think the most important thing to remember when, hearing a lot of pharma's opposition to HR 3 or Medicare negotiation in general is that they incorrectly state that R&D, that all innovation is funded through their profits, and that's simply not true. In fact, you asked, who should we be thanking? We should be thanking ourselves as taxpayers and the federal government. And that's because the federal government, through NIH and other agencies, invests billions of dollars in basic research. And that funding in turn generates a ton of downstream value. MIT researchers have concluded that for every $125 million in NIH grants, it leads to $375 million more in private market, 33 patents, and 1 new drug. And I think, over the past 40 years, we've seen how important those long-term strategic federal investments are in developing new products. The clearest and most obvious and front of mind right now are the COVID vaccines. The vaccines are the result of decades of long-term investments by the federal government, followed by, and I think this is also really important to remember when you receive pushback from industry folks about the vaccines, also investments in the development, investments that essentially removed all the risk for bringing those products to market. The government essentially removed the bulk of the risk, not only related to scientific failures and failures to demonstrate efficacy and safety, but also it eliminated manufacturing risks and market risks related to low demand. So basically, the bottom line is COVID-19 vaccines are a public health success story. And right now, I think this is the federal investment in the COVID-19 and the necessity of those investments really show that they're necessary because the industry focuses their R&D on what they think will be the most profitable, not what the public and public health needs. And, because of that, and because the incentives right now are really misaligned with what we need, when designed properly, prescription drug negotiation, Medicare negotiations such as HR 3 can really fix those incentives and really result in very innovative products and encouraging more innovative products coming to market.
Thank you for sharing. Dr. Rome or Dr. Socal, do you have any other comments?
I would just add that not all innovation is as innovative as we normally assume. Typically, if you pick a random year, there's over 100 new drugs entering the US market, but about only 50 to maximum 60 of these drugs really are new molecular entities. So a lot of the new drugs are innovated and launched and enter the US market every year. They're not really bringing new value to the market. Research done here at Johns Hopkins, we showed that 75% of the very expensive drugs, they're not really necessarily better than the clinical treatment that is available without those drugs. So it's not only about, are we going to lose innovation? It's also about what kind of innovation we really want. And that's a debate, and I will agree with Maura that so much of it is funded through the government and done in academic centers, and finding value in these new drugs will not necessarily stop just because we're regulating or negotiating part of the reward for this innovation.
I totally agree with everything my colleagues have said here. I think it's just important to keep in mind that the idea that the pharmaceutical industry and that pharmaceutical innovation is going to somehow grind to a halt if we change pricing structure is just not true. And while we can acknowledge that pharmaceutical industry does play an important role, I think what my colleagues have talked about in terms of the public investment in drugs isn't going to go away if we change how drugs are priced. If you think about ACE inhibitors, statins, TNF inhibitors, and the COVID vaccines, I mean, all of these, like, you can trace back to to public funding. And so the idea that we wouldn't get these types of innovations, just doesn't hold up if you sort of think about it. And the status quo is really not incentivizing the right type of innovation, as we've talked about. So we like to think that just as high, you just keep ratcheting up prices and you spend more and more money, and that's going to get you more and more innovation. But that isn't necessarily the case. And by being more targeted and being more thoughtful about sort of making sure that the drugs that we sort of let to be expensive are the ones that are the best for patients, may actually get us a far better outcomes.
Thank you for that on the first question, bringing some very important points up. And we're talking about, developing new drugs, but another thing is the money aspect of things. So the flow of money from patients at the pharmacy counter and via health insurance premiums ultimately reaches pharmaceutical corporations. And this involves a lot of actors along the way, which includes the insurance companies, pharmacy benefit managers or PBMs, retailers, and distributors. So who bears responsibility for high drug prices in our current system, and how might this change with federal drug pricing reform? And if Dr. Rome, if you're interested in starting with that question.
Sure, I'm happy to, and then happy to take comments from the others as well. I mean, I think it's important to keep in mind that the pharmaceutical supply chain, like everything else in healthcare, is very complex, and there's a lot of moving parts. But this blame the middlemen line that we hear over and over again from pharmaceutical companies, it's kind of absurd, right? I mean, ultimately, it's drug companies that are choosing to set the prices for their products. We can take a recent example. So Aduhelm, or aducanumab, was recently approved by the FDA to treat Alzheimer's disease. And there was no evidence that the drug worked. And the drug's manufacturer, Biogen, set the price at $56,000 per year. This isn't an outlier. There are dozens of medications we could list off with prices that are even higher than that. And so this sort of pricing behavior can't really be blamed on PBMs or insurance companies, as there's so much finger pointing that happens. We've set up a system where we basically give drug manufacturers monopoly pricing power. They set the prices as high as they think the market will bear. That said, I think it's important to keep in mind that insurance companies and pharmacy benefit managers, who are part of the supply chain, do play an important role, particularly in setting the out-of-pocket costs, which is the share of a drug's price that the patients are paying at the pharmacy counter when filling a prescription. So 1 in 4 patients say that they can't afford their medications in the US. So it's clear that these out-of-pocket costs are a major part of the problem. And one of the key problems is that insurance companies and PBMs charge patients higher and higher out-of-pocket costs, despite the fact that behind the scenes, they're negotiating confidential rebates from the drug manufacturers, and they're not passing those rebates along to the patients. And to me, this shows that the PBMs and the insurance companies aren't doing a good enough job protecting patients from high prices set by manufacturers. And to me, that's even more reason that we should stop letting drug manufacturers set prices as high as they want to set them. And it's important also to reform the insurance industry and make sure that we're protecting vulnerable patients, particularly in Medicare Part D, where there's really no limit on how much patients can pay out of pocket right now. And if you keep in mind, if you look at the entirety of HR 3, Part D reform is an important, really crucial and important part of the framework. But we can't just fix out-of-pocket costs, right? We have to fix the underlying high prices. Otherwise, we're just providing a Band-Aid to the problem.
If I can add that, when you were talking, Ben, I was just remembering it's every single year when my students start, I always tell them this is a quiz question, and it always is, which is who sets the prices for drugs in the US? And the only correct answer is the drug manufacturer. That's the only entity that is in charge of setting a price for a drug today. And everything else that happens needs agreement from the pharmaceutical manufacturer. Every single negotiation, every single change in the price that is actually going to be paid down the line needs the manufacturer to agree with that. I would add a few details in the answer that Ben provided, which is number one, we do have a problem with middlemen, and the specific problem is not necessarily in the negotiation part. It's because the middleman who is in charge of negotiation, the pharmaceutical benefit manager, they profit off of these negotiations. So they are allowed to keep a portion of whatever lower price they negotiate. They're allowed to keep a portion of that for themselves as a revenue. So if they have a more expensive product that gives them more discounts and rebates versus a cheaper product, sometimes a generic even, that is not able to give so many discounts and rebates because it already is cheaper to start with, sometimes we will see this distortion in which the pharmacy benefit manager will choose to have the expensive product and have that covered and have that utilized instead of a cheaper option. So that is one of the reasons why we talk not only about prices, but also about spending. Even if prices are low, for example, for the low cost generic, we may be spending more because we're choosing to spend on the higher price drug. And that spending translates to higher spending to the beneficiary, because when a person is asked to pay a percentage of the drug cost as their cost share today, so this is especially important for high cost drugs. For low cost drugs, the plan sets a $5 copay, a $10 copay, but that's not where the problem is. When a person needs a very expensive, for example, a biologic, that's exactly when the plan is going to charge them a percentage of the drug cost. And here, the big problem is that that percentage is calculated off of the price that the manufacturer has set or very close to that price. So like Ben just said, the patient doesn't benefit from the actual price that the insurer will pay. Not only because the insurer, it's not necessarily because the insurer doesn't want to, it's because that price is not even going to be known sometimes months after the transaction has occurred. So the distortion in there is that the patient gets exposed to those higher list prices, and manufacturers have chosen to sort of bridge that gap by offering, for example, patient assistance programs, copay cards, and a lot of different strategies to offset a problem that they have created by having these high list prices that get negotiated later and having patients exposed to these high prices. We can't have the same entity be the creator of the problem and the creator of the solution. Because when we do that, sometimes patient assistance programs, coupons, and other things help move patients and steer patients to more expensive options. By telling a patient, oh, you don't need to pay anything out of pocket with this copay card, sometimes the hidden cost to the insurer will be very, very large. So insurers are also on the hook. It's just different incentives acting at different points in time in this entire transaction.
If I could just add to, I think those points are completely critical to understanding the problem. I would say, just to explain it in another way, we all pay for these drugs regardless of whether we're the ones actually taking it. As my co-panelist said, these costs are passed along to the insurers and to employers. And not only do we pay through higher premiums, but the impact of these costs really extends beyond the healthcare system. So for example, the federal healthcare programs, once a drug is approved, they have to pay, they basically have to cover these drugs. If you take, for example, a Medicaid program, a large, 50 to 80% of that cost is borne by the state. States can't deficit finance their budgets. States have to balance their budget each year. So if you are, paying too much for certain drugs, you're squeezing out other absolutely essential benefits and services to residents, everything from education to other social services. So it's just imposing, it's a problem for the healthcare system. It's also a problem for all of us and other priorities that we all care about.
Thank you for your comments. Transitioning to our third question. In order for patients to benefit from prescription drugs, they must be able to access them. We know that access is impacted by cost. how will allowing Medicare to negotiate drug prices impact the access our patients have to current and future prescription drugs? And Dr. Socal, you kind of mentioned this in your response, so if you would like to start.
Absolutely. Well, we know that Medicare is one of the largest payers for prescription drug in our country, right? It's covering older individuals, it's covering individuals with multiple chronic conditions, and it's covering all the treatments that are involved in taking care of these patients. And drugs, of course, are a huge component of that. So Medicare is a very important payer in prescription drug space. Currently, the way that the Medicare negotiation happens for drug prices in the Part D program that is in charge of prescription drugs is a Medicare beneficiary will enroll in a certain prescription drug plan. It will choose a prescription drug plan in enrollment period. And then during the year, the person will be served by that plan. There's multiple plans in the marketplace. And each plan will have one entity, one pharmacy benefit manager negotiating with drug manufacturers on their behalf. So if you take 40 million people in Medicare Part D today, these 40 million people, we're not negotiating for all of them at the same time. Currently, we're breaking them up in smaller groups, smaller and smaller and smaller groups, and each one of these groups is negotiating with manufacturers for the same drugs, but they're negotiating for lower prices. So one, we're missing the opportunity of having strength in numbers and having, the secretary negotiate on behalf of this whole market, because we know that drug manufacturers tend to offer bigger price concessions when they know their volume will be bigger. So when they know they're going to sell more of a certain drug, they're more likely to give more discounts and rebates on their drug. So that's a missed opportunity that we have today. And the second problem is that there is no transparency in this process, in the process that pharmacy benefit managers negotiate on behalf of Medicare patients. So like we just mentioned, the plan will pay a lower price, but the patient will only ever know the price that is either publicized or that they learn at the pharmacy counter. So if we allow the Medicare program to not only negotiate prices on behalf of Medicare patients, but also to publicize them, which will happen, then patients will also know, and they will also benefit from having a lower benchmark. So if they're paying a cost share that is a percentage of the drug cost, now they have a very clear calculated benchmark that is going to be known by everyone. In that, for example, in the beginning of the year, the patient can then calculate their cost share. Today, prices can fluctuate at any time. And if the patient started the year paying a certain amount of money, nobody knows what's going to happen in 3 months, in 6 months or more. So that type of negotiation would that necessarily increase access, because it would increase transparency, and it will most likely result in lower prices taken together.
I just added this whole issue around access, I find it very hard to understand this argument, right? Because prescription drugs already we have limited access for drugs, and the limitation in most situations is the high price patients. And so I think that ultimately is the key here to think about. When people are, when doctors and prescribers are, super frustrated about sort of inability to get their patients drugs, it's often because the insurance company has put in place tactics and these utilization management strategies, right, to prevent you from using expensive drugs for your patients. Maybe you have to get a prior authorization, or maybe you have to try a less expensive option first, which maybe you don't think is going to work. Those things can be extraordinarily frustrating. But the whole reason that the insurance companies have resorted to using these sort of strategies is because the prices are high in the first place. And so, this tension is there, and the idea that if we lower prices, somehow access is going to get worse just doesn't make, intuitive sense. I think one of the pieces that comes out in this conversation is Medicare not going to cover certain drugs? But as Mariana just said, Medicare and Medicaid essentially cover all drugs. With very few exceptions, and so that's not really what's up for debate here. In fact, the fact that they have to cover all the drugs limits their ability to negotiate the prices in the first place. So we've really tied these public programs' hands in terms of sort of having to pay whatever price the manufacturer wants, only being able to negotiate rebates if there's a competitive market, which isn't always true, and then not having any sort of weight, any sort of leverage to negotiate. So
I would just add that you probably have seen a lot of ads on TV or on Facebook or other social media platforms, and they all are industry focused that talk about this access argument because it's just it's a simple scare tactic. There is absolutely nothing in HR 3 or any of the other proposals being considered by Congress that would limit access, that would change Medicare or Medicaid coverage pieces, and it is, I think, it is just plain and simple a scare tactic. I mean, basically what the industry is saying is that, oh, if you make us sit down and negotiate prices with the secretary, we're going to pull out of the entire US market. And I mean, that is just, first of all, I mean, putting aside that I can't imagine that they would do that. I mean, we are the largest market in the world right now, highest prices. We will still have the highest prices once this goes through. So I just would urge you all to call out and pass along the words that anything related to access is just pure industry scare tactics.
I think that's a really good transition into my next question, and how the pharmaceutical industry tends to point fingers at other portions of the healthcare system. So nearly 1 in every $5 we spend as a country is directed towards healthcare. We use this money to pay for many services, including hospitalizations, doctor's visits, long-term care facilities, and of course, prescription drugs. And prescription drugs costs account for about 20% of all overall health costs. So why is it important to address the rising costs of prescription drugs? And what about the other drivers of high cost of the healthcare system?
I like to call this the distraction argument, right? It's that, there's another problem and therefore you shouldn't fix, this problem. I mean, it is totally true that there are a lot of things in healthcare that cost too much, and there's lots of opportunities for savings, but we're spending $500 billion each year on prescription drugs. So if we don't think that's something that's worth, thinking about, I think, as you said in your introduction, we're spending 2.5 times more than other countries on these products. And for patients, patients with diabetes or high blood pressure or asthma, they're going to the pharmacy on a monthly basis and they're really feeling these prices, and they're having adverse effects on their ability to afford the medicines, to take the medicines, and therefore the medicines won't work if they're not able to take them. So, these high costs really do touch patients on a really, personal level and are very visible. But that said, I mean, we should address everything in cost in the healthcare system, but the fact that there's other problems shouldn't mean we should avoid drugs.
I would also, go ahead. Do you want to go? I would just say also that, especially for the Medicare program, as we've alluded to before, drugs are the one place that we do not actually have very specific price regulation. The fee schedules, the payment systems, all of those are designed to get at the per unit price of items and services in the healthcare system in the Medicare program. And the Medicare Part D program is completely different. And then of course, Part B, as in boy, your physician administered drugs, we just simply pay 106% of whatever, the manufacturers have decided to put their prices out there with some adjustments. But it ignores the fact that there's already, I'm not saying that it's enough, and there's still a lot more to do for these other parts of the system, but it ignores the fact that drug prices are still so behind in terms of how we treat them in the Medicare program.
Right, and I was just going to allude to our medical audience today, in which, I think as doctors, we are rarely satisfied just to, take a look at the symptoms of the patient and treating it. We are always concerned about what's the root cause of things, what's driving this problem, why is this even happening? And I think in the drug pricing universe, this whole conversation about, prices are increasing, spending is increasing. For prescription drugs, I think there's a few key facts that we have to keep in mind whenever we talk about why this is so important. The first thing is that, yes, there's more drugs in the market. People are taking more drugs over time. That is all true. But if we sum up the effect of just taking more drugs, this accounts for about 3 to 3.5% of the whole growth in spending. Really what drives our increasing spending on drugs right now is the prices of drugs that are going up. So yes, we're taking a little bit more drugs. Yes, we're selecting drugs that are more expensive, but it is how expensive these drugs are on the first place that is really motivating our whole growth in spending. And the second fact that I wanted to highlight is that we're not only seeing growth in prices because we have new drugs in the market. That's part of something that we can intuitively understand. If I have a new advancement, a drug that is better than everything else, and the drug is coming up in the market and it's a more expensive drug, that makes sense to some extent in our minds. But in our research, we found that the largest price differentials between the prices that we pay here in the United States and prices that other industrialized countries pay abroad, the highest price differentials were happening not for recently launched drugs, not for new drugs. New drugs are expensive to everyone. Maybe they're a little bit less expensive elsewhere, but they are also expensive. The problem is for old drugs, very, very old drugs. Humira, for example, has been in the market almost 20 years. HP Acta is a drug that has been in the US market since 1950s. Insulin, has been in the US market since the 1920s. These are the drugs that every other country in the world has mechanisms to lower their prices over time. And in this country, these are the drugs that have been increasing prices. So if the argument from pharmaceutical manufacturers hold that it's the drug development that is costly, and it's the investments on new and promising drugs that is driving the need for more revenue to them, then there will be no real reason to just increase prices for these older drugs over time. And that's what's really burdening our system. It's the increasing prices without any known or obvious reason. And honestly, the best evidence that we have is investigations. So we have investigations from the Senate Finance Committee, from the House Oversight Committee. As recent as 2021, we had hearings about this, with the president of AbbVie, the CEO of AbbVie, and other CEOs trying to justify why have they been increasing prices so much. And when you just open up the documents from the industry, it has all to do with quarterly earnings, shareholder reports, and all sorts of, salaries inside the organization. It has very little to do with actual drug development, actual innovation, and all these talking points that we hear about all the time.
I just want to add to one thing or sort of reiterate one thing that Maura said, which is if you think about the Medicare program, most of the people on this call are doctors. Medicare sets prices for everything in healthcare, right? Hospitalizations, there's a fee schedule. Office visits, there's a fee schedule. Procedures, there's a fee schedule. It's set sort of how much Medicare is willing to pay. Drugs are really the only part of the Medicare program where Medicare is forced to pay essentially whatever the manufacturer wants. So when you hear this idea that it's going to be, it's a socialist system, or this is going to make drugs and somehow attack drugs in a particular way, that's not true, right? It's just going to bring drugs more in line with how the rest of the Medicare program works and manages costs.
Thank you for your comments. At this time, I have one more question, but I would also like to encourage our participants to kind of drop their own questions so we can transition to the participant-led portion of the session today. And something that is, in particular interest of me as a future physician, as well as colleagues who are doing research into various different drugs possibilities. As of 2019, 1 in 7 workers in the United States work in healthcare. Jobs are critical for economic well-being. During the COVID pandemic, we have seen how losing a job, and often healthcare insurance with it, can be devastating for patients and their families. So what specific impact may HR 3 have on jobs for Americans who work in the healthcare industry? And Ms. Calsyn, if you would like to answer that question first, that'd be great.
Sure. I think I'm assuming what you are setting up is some of the claims by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the industry that passing HR 3 would result in about 1 million jobs. So if you bear with me with a little bit of background and numbers, I think we can easily debunk that. Also, according to the Chamber of Commerce, the biopharmaceutical industry employs about 800,000 Americans, with another directly with another about 3 million people who are supported by the industry, from everything from construction to business services, transportation. So then what they've done is they are saying that of those jobs, we'd lose 1 million. So I think when you think about let me back up. I want to make 2 points. One is that the most I think you would ever see from savings from one of these bills is about 600 or 700 billion. That seems like a big number until you realize that projected spending for just retail prescription drugs in this country over the next 10 years is 4.4 trillion. So when you think about that, it's really, of the bucket of money going to the industry, it's not that much. But more importantly, I mean, this is just completely ignoring how companies currently operate. As Dr. Socal said, we are seeing a lot of evidence come out through Congress about how companies are spending money on stock buybacks and dividends. Actually, between 2016 and 2020, the industry spent about $56 billion more on stock buybacks and dividends than they did on R&D, going back to my initial point that simply profits are not funding R&D in this country. So I think when you think about, all of the marketing, advertising budgets, the stock buybacks, the dividends, combined with the fact that their numbers just don't line up, we're not going to see a third of the jobs related to this industry just fall away because they are suddenly going to still pay, because we as Americans are still going to pay the highest prices in the world, but we won't be paying quite as high. So, it just doesn't stand up to any sort of scrutiny at all.
And, if we can open up the discussion to other types of jobs, a large part of the research that I do has to do with the large self-insured employers. And self-insured employers, they have been feeling, the burden from these growing expenditures on drug pricing, on drug and prescription drugs. And, it is very important, in my opinion, that we see this problem from a more comprehensive perspective, like a whole entire market perspective, because these employers oftentimes have chosen not only to, deny employment to people, but also when people are employed, they have been choosing to change the way that their coverage works. So one trend that we have been seeing increasingly is having patients enroll in high deductible health plans. Let's not forget that enrollment, it's either if it's for a private plan or a Medicare Part D plan, it happens once a year. So you're stuck with your choice for the year. So if you start the year feeling that you're reasonably healthy and you don't anticipate to need much during the year, you choose a high deductible health plan, which means, for the very first, until a threshold, typically it can be $2,000, $4,000. And so until that threshold is met, you're paying list price for everything, especially drugs. So if the year starts and all of a sudden one of these patients needs a Humira, for example, or a biologic, they are on the hook for basically the entire price of that drug. So that's one way that even people with employment today can have a real hard time affording their drug. Second way where even fully insured people can have a hard time affording their drug through paying co-insurance, a percentage of the drug cost, like I just mentioned. Because the insurer negotiates a lower price at the end of the day, those 20% that the patient pay, sometimes they represent half of the total price that gets paid for the drug, because price concessions and rebates bring prices down so much. So one, employment would actually, over the course of years, be able to increase if employers were able to spend less with their healthcare spending, and especially prescription drug spending. But also those with employment would have more affordable options to pay for their drugs, either because they don't need to pay full price or because they are paying a percentage of something that is not that high to start with.
Thank you for all your responses. I want to kind of transition now to some of the questions that our participants have been bringing up. So from the chat, I'll read it out loud for everybody. Is it true or not that PBMs drive down competition in the generic market by contracting preferentially with a few manufacturers, thereby creating artificial shortages of generic meds and driving up prices? And if true, is this even a significant factor in overall drug costs?
I'll just start by saying that it's really, really important to think about generic drugs and brand name drugs totally differently. They're kind of two separate markets. And so, just remember that, patents essentially give new drugs a 20-year period, or ends up being 15 to 20-year period when they have no competition. That's what we call brand name drugs, where there's no competition for that drug. Those drugs only represent, depending on what you look at, about 10% of the prescriptions in the United States, but 90% of the spending. Okay, so the generic drugs account for 90% of all prescriptions and only 10% of the spending. So, there are a lot of games being played in the generic drug markets. The middlemen, including the pharmacies here, play a big role, and it's a very complex market. There definitely can be, effects in terms of overall spending, but where HR3 focuses and where sort of the majority of policymakers are focusing attention, rightly so, is on brand name drugs. And so that's just sort of where I would steer the question.
And I would add that what you said is true in terms of PBMs. So PBMs, for branded drugs, most of the competition will happen between a brand and another brand. If it's a brand and a generic that is directly equivalent, the pharmacy can choose to dispense the generic and everybody can be saving money. And let me add that generics are an incredible success story in this country. We should also talk about the positives, right? So generics are an incredible success story. They do succeed. They have succeeded historically in bringing down prices, not only their own prices, but also prices of the branded drug that, corresponds to them. But if we forget about the multi-source drugs where, typically costs have been brought down over the course of the years, and we talk about branded drugs without a direct generic, these drugs will have competition in the form of other branded drugs. I'll give you an example: COPD inhalers, asthma inhalers, everything is a brand. So in order to negotiate a lower price for your formulary and to offer to your enrollees in your insurance plan, the insurer will hire the PBM, so the pharmacy benefit manager, to help, put these manufacturers of these branded drugs against each other to see who will offer a higher price concession, a bigger discount, so that that product can go into the formulary. Now, the problem here is that, number one, because all of these are branded products, the price concessions that they will offer, the rebates, they are confidential. They are considered trade secrets. And oftentimes, and this probably will come as a new information to many of you, oftentimes even the plan sponsor, so even the insurer, does not get full information at how these actual prices are. The insurer will have some information, but sometimes they don't have the full information, because only the PBM sometimes holds the true truth about everything that they negotiated. So that's problem number one. It is non-transparent. So I, as the insurer, or I as the patient, I don't know if my COPD inhaler was actually the cheapest one, or if it was because that manufacturer paid more to the PBM to put my inhaler in the formulary. And we have done research about this. People taking inhaled medication, people taking injectable medication, all these medications that need an administrator, like a pen or an inhaler to be utilized, they are the brand competition. And these medications often get changed year after year because the PBM got a better deal. And I'm sure you also see them in your clinical practice. So that creates a whole issue of, adherence behaviors and other things. But the rebates is just part of the problem. The next part of the problem is that whenever you have two branded drugs, in order to substitute for a cheaper one, patients need a new doctor prescription. They need a new prescription to be able to get a cheaper product. And that in itself sometimes creates an insurmountable barrier that people cannot go back and get a new prescription. And finally, that also generates an opportunity for manufacturers to say, hey, here, there's a coupon. You will pay only $5 out of your own pocket. So patients will sometimes come to the doctor's office and say, hey, the branded drug that you're prescribing me costs me $40 because I pay a percentage of it. But if I have this coupon and I take the other one, that only will cost me $5. From a doctor's perspective, I totally get it that we would want to prescribe something that my patient can afford better. But the problem is oftentimes these coupons, they will overshadow the fact that these are more expensive drugs and that they will cost more to the system. So that's one of the problems that gets created by PBMs negotiating all of this, is because, you know, the non-transparency and all the barriers to access that we see. And the other problem is that not always we have enough drugs to be able to make this mechanism work. One example, you know, very recent was when COVID started, we had, you know, the vaccines coming up, we had antiviral medication coming up. Sometimes when you just have one option in the market, how are you going to put that against something else in order to get price concessions? So for certain drugs, without competition, this model doesn't work because you can't negotiate. And that's why HR3, that's a gap that HR3 would help fill this gap by having a new option for negotiation for these situations where PBMs cannot really do their job.
A lot of questions I'm receiving right now are about the influence on a private insurance if Medicare is able to negotiate prices. So from one of the questions is, if we let Medicare negotiate prices, isn't there a danger that there will be cost shifting and the private/commercial plans will end up paying even more to make up for the loss of profits from the Medicare programs? Shouldn't we extend these negotiated prices to the commercial market as well to avoid potential cost shifts?
That's exactly what HR3 does. It makes the prices available to commercial payers. So it's also why it's supported by it's supported by private insurers, it's supported by businesses, it's supported by unions.
I think something that, just to sort of echo what Mariana was just saying, is it's so hard to know what a drug costs in the United States. It's been made so difficult to understand. So if Medicare can set prices for these drugs and negotiate like what we think is a value-based price, and that becomes the price of the drug, it simplifies everything across the whole supply chain. It gets rid of so many of these games back and forth between the PBM and the manufacturer.
I would also add, I think we've really focused most of the discussion on negotiation, but I think another key component of HR3 is that it would limit price increases on existing drugs. So it gets to launch prices through negotiation or through the selection of drugs on the market to negotiate. But then it also puts a cap on the amount that a manufacturer can raise the price of the drug beyond inflation. So if a manufacturer hikes up a drug beyond inflation, it would have to rebate that difference back to the government. I think what made me realize that we should flag it for people is because just as the negotiated price would apply to the commercial market, that provision also would apply to the commercial market.
I think that brings up a great point. So Eli Lilly today actually announced that they're authorizing a generic for Humalog, Lispro, and they're going to reduce that back to their 2008 prices. What do you all make of this, and how do authorized generics released by pharmaceutical companies factor into the overall drug pricing equation?
So I mean, authorized generics are a hugely complex topic. So I'll first say what authorized generics are, and then sort of answer your question a little bit, but say there's a lot that we probably don't have time to talk about. But authorized generics are not really, they're sort of a misnomer. They're not a generic. It's not made by a separate manufacturer. An authorized generic is the same pill as the brand name drug, and the brand name drug manufacturer is making royalties off selling it. They just don't put the brand name on it. They just put the generic name. This has become a common strategy for some of these really expensive drugs that are under political pressure to lower their prices. Instead of just slashing the prices, as would be sort of you'd expect them to do, they launch an authorized generic and essentially sort of have this competition within itself to allow some of these rebate games to keep going. That's not how it works most of the time with authorized generics. There's also authorized generics for these multi-source drugs, but I think that's sort of beyond the scope of today's conversation. So ultimately, what it tells me when Lilly starts to do these strategies is that, so I think a lot of drug manufacturers are recognizing that, there's a lot of political pressure on them right now, that the prices are too high, especially for these older products like insulins. In the recent report that came out from the Congressional Staffer Committee, you saw that the average rebates in Medicare Part D plans for insulins were often over 75%. I think it was something like 50% for Lantus and over 75% for a few of the shorter acting insulins. So, I mean, that tells you that we're just at this point where we've passed the point of normalcy. I mean, when the price that is actually being paid is 25% of the price that's listed, you can just tell that there's games being played. I don't think patients are benefiting from those games at all.
And I'd like to add that Senator Warren last year, her office together with other senators, they released research on the insulin authorized generics. So they actually called pharmacies and checked, one, if the pharmacy was going to offer the authorized generic, and two, if the authorized generic was available. So they found out that actually for the authorized generics that had been already announced previously, the availability of these generics in pharmacies, in actual pharmacies, was minimal. So there is a big question mark here as to, are these real products that are going to see the light of the day in the actual market, or are these PR stunts just to get, I mean, it cannot be a coincidence that this gets announced in a week that we are debating the whole issue about prescription drug pricing legislation. So I agree that manufacturers are feeling the pressure. The way that they're trying to respond to that pressure has being very diverse in many ways. So some manufacturers have tried to expand their coupon use, expand their patient assistance programs, and other manufacturers have launched new products in the market. The big question that I feel that I have in my mind every time I see these announcements is, why the heck didn't they just lower the price, of their main product? And the answer to that is that the prices of products, they're all tied, within the market. So if the drug manufacturer would choose to actually announce the actual price of their drug to the broad market, there are price calculations that take those announced prices, and they will, it almost sets up a chain reaction that will result with lower prices across the board for everyone. One example, Medicaid. Medicaid gets the best price, but it's calculated off the price that is negotiated in the broader market. So if you just lower the list price for everybody, there's this trickling down of lower prices that, everybody would pay, which, for us as a society would be great. But for manufacturers, they try to avoid that by then launching a new product and having the lower price in that new product. And another issue is that if list prices were actually down, reflecting actual prices paid, then they would have no serials tool to have their drug incorporated into the formulary to offer to the PBM. Because PBMs do profit from the rebates and price concessions that they negotiate, if manufacturers were to just set prices low, they wouldn't have a lot to offer PBMs, and their products would not be on the formulary. I believe that was February 2019, when there was a hearing where 3 drug manufacturers for insulins were set next to 3 representatives of the largest PBMs. It was a congressional hearing by the House Oversight Committee, and these members of the industry and of the PBM industry, they were very clear, and they clearly stated that if list prices were close to the actual negotiated price, there would be no incentive for the PBM to have that on the formulary. So allowing that to happen is a big distortion in our market.
Thank you. We've had a lot of great questions in the chat, and unfortunately, because of time constraints, it'll be kind of difficult to attack all of them at once. But I do want to ask our panelists if they could kind of share a little bit more of any other thoughts they might have about our discussions today, or anything else that could help guide our participants on any other interests that might be something to look into for HR3, or any other things that might be pertinent to drug pricing reform.
I can go really quickly. I believe it was Ben who mentioned this. I think it's really important for folks to take a look at what HR3 would mean for the Part D out-of-pocket structure. Right now, there is no out-of-pocket limit. This would put one in place. And in addition to that, the other thing we haven't really talked about at all that I think is important for people to know is that HR3 would, some of the savings achieved by HR3 would then be reinvested in biopharmaceutical research at the federal level. So, a lot of the, as much as we've talked about why HR3 would not impact and would potentially really help innovation move in the way that I think all of us would like to see it, in addition to it not having an impact, it also reinvests those savings in a really helpful way to advance science in the future.
I'll just reiterate the sort of three big parts of HR3, because I think Maura just got to one of them, but I think just to summarize sort of what this piece of legislation does, but honestly, sort of what the Senate has been discussing as well, and sort of really been the sort of key parts of drug pricing legislation. So first is the Medicare price negotiation, which again is really a broader way to say, we're just not going to let manufacturers, set whatever prices they want during these monopoly periods that we give them. And then two is the lack of limiting their ability to raise prices each year, which again plays into this pricing game they're playing with the PBMs. They're raising the prices, offering bigger rebates, squeezing out patients. And so we got to just stop that game from happening. And if a manufacturer really thinks that there's data that suggests their drug is better than it was last year, great, but that's usually not the case. And then the third piece is the reforming Part D, because the Part D, benefit design really just was designed a long time ago and needs to be updated. Some of the patients who come to me with the biggest challenges supporting their medications for diabetes and other problems are people on Part D and it's still in the coverage gap, or just who have just are reaching the end of the year and just now paying 5% on every drug, and it just becomes unbearable. So that simply has to change. And I think I saw some comments in the chat, and there's some really good reforms in there.
And I would add, again, as clinicians, we tend to have one problem. We tend to look at symptoms, put together in a syndrome and try to address everything with one therapy. And in drug pricing, unfortunately, that's not possible. That's why we need a combination of policies. And because the distorted incentives, they act upon multiple different entities at the same time in the same system. And there's not just one solution that can magically, align everything together the way we wish. So that's the reason why we need these packages with multiple different strategies to have a better affordability at the end of the day.
Thank you. I wanted to close our lunch and learn session by thanking our wonderful panelists for great conversation and volunteering their time. Ms. Calsyn, Dr. Rome, Dr. Socal, we're really grateful for us. We're very grateful you were able to join us today. We'll be adding a link to the chat for you to take action with us with DFA to encourage lawmakers to act and lower prices for our patients and also pass HR3. And you'll see that in the chat as well. I wanted to also share some quick reminders. This event will be available on YouTube on DFA's website, so you can watch it again in the future. And we'll also be including a survey in our chat, and this gives us an opportunity to kind of learn what you liked about the session, what sessions you might be interested in the future. And so you can look for that in your chat box below, as well as in an email you'll be receiving tomorrow. And then please remember to follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook to stay up to date on all DFA programs, events, and ways to get engaged in our communities. You can check our events page on our website to see our several events that are coming up soon. Thanks for attending, everybody, and have a great day. Stay safe and stay active.